So wild dogs, until quite recently, wild dogs have not had a good reputation, really. They've been regarded as ruthless and wanton killers. And even the first warden of the Kruger National Park, Colonel James Stevenson Hamilton, in 1947 wrote about wild dogs. He called them a terrible foe to game with a wasteful method of hunting. He said, there is no other predatory animal in Africa responsible for so much disturbance of game, and in proportion to his numbers, there's none that deals out more wholesale destruction. Undoubtedly, the most extreme statement that would make even the most tweets of you-know-who look innocuous was written by a man called R.C.F. Maughn, who was what they called in those days a naturalist and a sportsman. In his book, Wild Game in Zambezia, he said this: "Let us consider for a while a nation that blot upon the many interesting wild things, the murderous wild dog. It will be an excellent day for African game and its preservation when means can be devised to give practical effect to some well thought out for this unnecessary creature's complete extermination." In 1991, the conservation journal Oryx published a paper called titled The Wild Dog, Africa's Vanishing Carnivore. And in that paper, there was a review of the status of the species, which found that it was extinct in 25 of the 39 countries in its range. And the authors concluded that it was unlikely that there were more than 5,000 individuals in all of sub-Saharan Africa. There were only two populations of over 500 animals, one in the Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania and the other, the Okavango region in Botswana, and about three of over 250, one of which was a national park. On the strength of that paper and of course of other information, the IUCN declared the wild dog an endangered species in about in the early 1990s. And as Kruger Park had one of the last viable, last large populations, we in the parks had obviously a commitment to learn more about this species and what threats and how it was doing in Kruger. So we started the project in 1989. So the first thing we wanted to know was how many wild dogs are there in the park? That was a sort of a basic question. And of course, it's not easy to count wild dogs. You can't do aerial surveys, ground counts are difficult. But as you can see from this photo, and as is well known, of course, wild dogs have very distinct markings. And so we decided that, and because Kruger has such a good road network, so many tourists, even in those days, were visiting, we initiated a citizen science project, the first citizen science project in Kruger, where we asked tourists who visited the park to send us photographs of wild dogs. And of course, in those days, we were not on digital, everything was on film. There was no email, it was all posting and postages. But in that year of the project, we received over 5,000 photographs of wild dogs. And from that, we were able to determine that there were a population of about 357 wild dogs in the Kruger National Park. So we asked ourselves, why are there only 357 wild dogs? Why are there such a small number of wild dogs when, for example, there are 2,500 spotted hyenas and nearly 2,000 lions? What are the reasons for the very low population of wild dogs in the Kruger Park? So we started this project where we tried to look into this aspect and find out if we could see what the issues were and what was regulating the population. So one of the first things we looked at were the genetics and possibility of disease. It has, because it's a confined area, there was a possibility that maybe the population was inbred and that was having an impact on the population. And there was a lot of anecdotal stories around that wild dogs are very vulnerable to diseases such as rabies and distemper. So we worked with a team of veterinarians and geneticists, and we came up, looked at the genetics of wild dogs, and we found that, in fact, the population was what we call genetically heterozygous. There didn't seem to be any problem about inbreeding. And as far as the disease was concerned, we looked for antibodies in blood. We examined a number of wild dogs, and that conclusion was we found no evidence of disease, especially rabies and canine distemper, having an impact on the wild dogs. And in fact, at that time, rabies had never been noticed or found in wild animals from Kruger. So then we said, okay, well, that's not giving us much information. What else is there? Obviously, food. So we looked at food and how food might be limiting wild dog populations, or the wild dog population. So we had to find out what wild dogs eat. And as we can see from this graph, impala make up the vast majority of the wild dog's diet in Kruger, about 3/4. A quarter is made up of other similar sized ungulates like reedbuck, bushbuck, kudu, steenbok, and duiker. So we reasoned that if wild dogs are, if impala is such an important species for wild dogs should track impala distribution. We should find more wild dogs in those areas where there are more impala. And so we looked at the densities of wild dogs and impala in different areas, and sure enough, we found a strong relationship between wild dog density and impala numbers. The only problem was that it was the exact opposite of what we'd expected. In those areas where wild dogs were most common, impala seemed to be less common. And the areas where there was a much higher density of impala, there was a lower density of wild dogs. So clearly something else, some other factor must be responsible for wild dog distribution. We started looking around for that. When we looked at mortality of wild dogs, we came up with the information that lion predation was the most important natural mortality that we could find. 38% of the animals that died that we found or documented dying were killed by lions. Interestingly enough, disease played a very small role. Human factors were mainly snares. They were reasonably important, but as I say, lion predation was by far the most important, followed up by infanticide and siblicide. In other words, wild dogs being killed by other wild dogs. And I'll go into that in more detail. So we started looking into the lion situation. And we divided the southern part of the park up into a number of landscapes, the habitats, and we did surveys for lions and wild dogs in these different areas. And then we ranked the different landscapes for how much they were favored by the two species. And here we did find what we thought we would find. We found that those areas that were preferred by lions were the ones that were most avoided by wild dogs, and vice versa. Concluded from that lions do have an impact on at least the distribution of wild dogs in the park. And in fact, at about that time and subsequently, a number of similar studies have been done in other parks in Africa and other places, and that has been found to hold quite true, that there's an inverse relationship between wild dog density and lion density. So we were also very interested, well, the next thing we wanted to look at was the hunting behavior of wild dogs. Those of you that have, of us that have watched any wildlife documentary will be told that the wild dog is probably Africa's most successful carnivore. that they hunt very efficiently in packs, and there's a great deal of cooperation between the members. They're cooperative hunters. We were fortunate that we were able to use the services of helicopter to follow wild dogs during the hunts and to actually observe from the air what they were doing. Incidentally, this is one of the largest packs of wild dogs we saw in the Kruger Park. As you can see, this aerial photograph, there are about 35 wild dogs hunting together in this group. And what we found was that we found very little evidence for cooperation amongst the dogs. Typically what they would do as they were moving through the bush, if they came across a herd of impala, the dogs would bombshell. They would run into the herd would run in all directions. Probably this is where this whole idea of wild dogs causing havoc amongst their prey comes from. But, each dog or single dogs would start selecting out an impala and chasing it, and most of them gave up very quickly. Some persisted, and the ones that persisted were the ones that persisted most were the ones that were most likely to be caught or to catch. And in fact, most of the time, one or maybe two dogs pulled down the impala. The rest had gone off in different directions. Sometimes they may, one other dog may have killed an impala, but usually it was, if they were successful, it was only one dog. And then that dog would then go and call to the other members of the pack to come and feed on the kill. We were also interested to see what type of prey the wild dogs were catching. So after the kills, we went and examined them. We looked to see try and look at their ages by looking at the teeth. You can tell by the wear on teeth, get an idea of the ages. And we were also interested in the condition of the wild dogs. And an animal, as you probably know, when it's got food, excess food, it stores fat, and then it draws on those fat reserves as food becomes scarcer. And the last reserves of fat that an animal draws on are in the femur bones. So if you examine the femur and look for the marrow and the amount of fat in the marrow of a femur, you can get an idea of the condition of the animal. If it's in good condition, the marrow is waxy and white and quite hard. But as it loses condition, as it draws fat out of the marrow, it becomes more watery and glycery and a lot less fat. And sure enough, we found that there was a strong selection for animals that were in poor condition and animals that were old that the wild dogs were catching. Now, during the course of our studies and during that time, we experienced obviously times of different rainfall. We had dry years and we had wet years. And we were interested to see that during drought years, when we did our aerial surveys, we had a chance of finding the wild dogs feeding on a kill than we did in the times when there was higher rainfall. There certainly seemed to be a much higher success rate of dogs hunting during droughts than areas of high rainfall, than times of high rainfall. Okay, so we'll leave that there. And the next thing we did was we were able to study the energy turnover in wild dogs. This was a first time that this has been done with wild animals. If I wanted to, for example, measure Chris Moreira's energy turnover, I would put him into a treadmill, although Chris Moreira doesn't really need a treadmill because he's on a treadmill his whole life. Anyway, you put the animal in a treadmill, put an oxygen mask on it, and of course we're all used to wearing masks these days, and we would then be able to measure the amount of carbon dioxide, and that gives you an idea of how much energy is being used, because the more you breathe, the more carbon dioxide you expel. So what we did, we injected a substance called doubly labeled water, which has isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen that are traceable. And by drawing blood samples or fecal samples from at certain stages afterwards, after this injection, you are able to determine the amount of energy used. Because as you see in this diagram, an animal takes in oxygen, O2, and it gives it out in two ways: by water, H2O, when it perspires or excretes and so on, and by carbon dioxide when it breathes out. And if you can measure the difference between the hydrogen and oxygen, the difference is equatable to energy consumption. So we did this experiment. First time, as I say, it had ever been done on any large free-living carnivore. And we came up with, we managed to do it on 6 animals. We came up with the interesting figure of 15,000 kilojoules of energy the dogs were using on a daily basis. Now, what does that mean? Well, perhaps the best comparison is if you look at a working border collie, which is about the same size as a wild dog, and those of you who have watched border collies working will know that they are frenetic, that they spend huge amounts of energy. Well, a wild dog on a normal day is consuming twice as much energy as a working border collie. Put another way, there's a famous equation called the Kruger equation, a physiological theoretical equation, which equates metabolic rate, that's the amount of energy turned over, with size. And as you can see from this graph, there's a very tight relationship between size and metabolic rate. As animals get bigger, so the metabolic rate goes up. And most mammals fall very much along that line. But our wild dogs, as you can see, were falling right outside what we'd expect. They were working at 5 or so times their basic metabolic rate. And theory suggests that if an animal is living or working at 6 times its metabolic rate, its basic metabolic rate, it's not going to survive. So the inference is that wild dogs are walking a energy tightrope. They really have to work very hard to get in enough energy for them to survive. So how do they do it? Well, if you look at a kilogram of venison, of meat, that contains about 5,200 kilojoules per kilogram. So that would mean that on average, to get up to 15,000, a dog would have to eat 3.1 kilograms of meat per day. Now, anyone who's eaten a 500-gram steak will know that that's quite a good meal. And most men that eat 500-gram steaks are probably 4 times the size of a wild dog. Wild dogs eat 6 500-gram steaks a day, and that's showing how much energy they are using up. And interestingly enough, our measured intake in the wild, what we thought that the wild dogs were feeding on from our observations was very close. It was at 3.5 kilograms per day. So that's all very interesting, but how does that tie into anything about understanding populations and so on? Well, wild dogs are only active for about 3 hours a day, and the rest of the time they spend resting, usually in the shade. So we constructed a fairly simple predictive model using our data of the rate of energy consumed when used when animals were at rest and moving, and the length of time they foraged. And we asked ourselves, well, what will happen if wild dogs start losing some kills to other predators, to what is called kleptoparasites? And hyenas, of course, would be the most likely one. Well, as you can see from this graph, if they're not losing anything, they're having to forage for about 3 hours, which is what we find. But it goes up very steeply. If they lost 25% of their kills, if they lost 1 in 4 kills to hyenas, the wild dogs would have to be up at going around for 15 to 18 hours a day. And quite obviously, that is unsustainable and impossible. Now in Kruger, wild dogs lose less than 10% of their kills to spotted hyenas. So this kleptoparasitism may not be a very big factor with Kruger wild dogs. But interestingly enough, at the same time as we were doing this work, Serengeti, where wild dogs occurred on the Serengeti plains, they lose a far larger proportion of their kills to hyenas. The very open area of the Serengeti plains, the higher number of density of spotted hyenas has certainly had a big impact. And during the early 1990s, there was an increase of lions and spotted hyenas on the Serengeti plains, probably almost certainly due to natural causes, and that caused the demise of the wild dogs. And wild dogs actually became extinct on the Serengeti plains. And certainly other studies have collaborated our findings, and that the density of spotted hyenas is inversely related to wild dogs. So wild dogs do reach higher densities at lower spotted hyena densities and vice versa. Now, as we know, the wild dog is a highly social species. Of the three large carnivores in Africa, social, there's the wild dog, the lion, and the spotted hyena. The wild dog is probably, in many ways, the most social. At least their pack is a very close. They move together almost always, whereas lions and spotted hyenas, although they're living in big groups, will come and go in a fission-fusion sort of way. But wild dogs are together all the time. The structure of a wild dog pack is well known, of course. There are the two animals, the alpha male and alpha female, the two that are the dominant animals, and they are really the most important animals in the pack, and they are responsible for reproduction. Wild dogs are different from other large carnivores in that they can breed every year. Most large carnivores, if they raise cubs, of course, they'll have to wait at least 18 months between litters unless they lose a litter. But wild dogs produce cubs seasonally at this time of the year. In fact, just about now, they'll be going to the dens in Kruger. And they also have large litters. The average litter size for Kruger was 10, but we found litters of up to 21. We had one female that gave birth to 21. We had two females that gave birth to 18. So they have very, very large litters on an annual basis. Now, for a female to feed that number of cubs is obviously a huge energetic load on her. And it's impossible for a female to raise her pups solely by producing milk. And from a very early age, wild dogs, of course, are supplemented with meat at the den by the other members of the pack. So wild dogs are what we call cooperative breeders. All the other members of the pack will combine and to help feed the cubs. They go to a kill, put the food in their stomachs, come home and regurgitate the food to the cubs. So they have a very close bond with the cubs and are very important in raising the cubs. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. Of course, nature is always has there's quite a bit of versatility. And in fact, we found that in Kruger, it's not unusual for more than one female to produce pups in a year. Almost without exception, it is the alpha female that produces her cubs first, and the second female will then produce about a week later, and usually not in the same den. The survival rate of the second female's pups is tenuous, to say the least. There are several factors that, first of all, the main pack, the pack will go to the main den, not feed the pups in the satellite den close by. And the alpha female can also have a big role. In some instances, the alpha female will actually kill the pups of the beta female. Now, I'm having a bit of a problem in getting my next slide up. Oh, there you go. No, it hasn't come up yet. So there is mortality. The pup, sometimes the alpha female will, in fact, even steal or try and steal the beta female's pups and take them to her den. But some females, and sometimes, as we saw in the previous slide, two females will have their pups together in the same den. And we had one female from the Duisburg pack called Anna-Marie. In 4 years, she produced 68 pups. And she was also very tolerant of subordinate females having pups and letting them join her at the den. And there was very little between her and the beta female pups. And this particular pack, the Duisburg pack here, the two females produced 28 pups. There were 23 adults in that pack. And for a while, there were 51 dogs in the Duisburg pack. All those pups came out of the den and survived. The next year after that very successful year, we had another very interesting situation where, again, the alpha female produced this time 17 pups at the den. And then after about, nothing happened, none of the other females produced until about 3 months later. Now, the denning period is usually 3 months. And just before they were due to leave the den, the beta female produced a litter of pups. So we were interested to see what was going to happen. Were the pack going to move off now because the first female's pups were getting big, or would they wait? And in fact, they waited. So for the first 3 weeks or so, the pack was at the den. The pups don't come out until they're about 3 weeks old, but about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, the beta females started coming out of the den. Now at this stage, the alpha female's pups were, as you can see, quite large, and they, like all wild dog pups or puppies, were very keen on lots of play, fighting, rough and tumble work, and so on. And when these new pups came out, these new small pups, they had some new playmates and they were very excited, and they started playing with these small guys that were almost helpless when they came out of the den. And we had a very bizarre situation where these pups actually killed beta female's pups, not aggressively, but just by playing with them. And they were easy to play with. And interestingly enough, the rest of the pack didn't interfere. They seemed to be fairly concerned, but they really didn't seem to know how to handle the situation. I think it was a situation, and it just doesn't really often happen. And the story ends even sadder, because one morning at about this time, when the small pups were starting to emerge, the beta female came out of the den. She had a collar on her and she moved off. And after about 2 or 3 hours, she hadn't returned. So we went to look for her. We found her. She'd gone down to a waterhole, and while she was drinking, she'd been ambushed by a lion and killed. And that was the end of the denning. After that, after she disappeared, the dogs left the den. We don't know how many pups were still left behind, but obviously none of those pups survived. So over the 15 years of our study, we did several surveys of the wild dog population in the same way as I said earlier. And we found there was quite a lot of variation. So as you can see here, the first year there was about the 350. In 1995, the population went right up to nearly 450. Then 5 years later, it had dropped drastically down to just over 150 or so. And the last year, 2005, it had gone down even more. So what was going on? Well, the one thing we have noticed, and these are the numbers of monthly sizes of wild dog packs in our study, that as you can see, there's a great deal of volatility in the wild dog in packs. So each year, in the middle of the year, there's an injection as they produce the pups, and the pack size goes up, and then gradually over the year, it whittles down, it gets smaller and smaller. Not all of it is due to mortality. A lot of it may be due to the pack breaking up or immigration and so on. And the other thing we noticed from this is that some packs will just peter out. Now, the interesting pack is this Doispan pack, the ones that had the 50 animals in 95 and the 94-95 season, but by 97, the pack was extinct. And what happened, I think there, one of the factors there was the alpha female. After she died, it seemed the whole pack seemed to split up. But other packs started and went for a while and then petered out. And in fact, in the series of the 15 years, only 2 packs survived for the whole 15 years. So there's lots of volatility in the pack. If we look at the population of wild dogs between 1990 and 2001, again, we see quite a lot of fluctuation. But what we also see here is that the gray, which are the adults, are far less volatile than the pups. It's the pup numbers that really fluctuate a lot. On average, a pack would have had 56% adults and 36% pups, but the variation in pups was far higher. The variance, 134 for adults and 400 for pups. So the pup section of the population is particularly volatile, and those are the ones that are going up and down a lot. So what are the reasons for these different sizes and different litter sizes and survival each year and over time and in different packs? The relationship between pack size and the number of pups produced. And although larger packs did seem to have more pups, it wasn't a very strong relationship. We started to look then at the influence of rainfall. And here we show the relationship between pup survival at different ages, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months, related to the previous 6 months rainfall. And here we find statistically a strong relationship, and the relationship shows that the drier the year, the higher the pup survival. So it's in the wet years that the pups are not doing nearly as well as in the dry years. And when we look at the relationship between population size in the Southern District and rainfall each year, we find a very strong correlation. Now, since I left Kruger in 2005, the study has continued. The Endangered Wildlife Trust have been monitoring the population, and they are showing again their population structures and numbers per year are showing this versatility, this volatility. Now, if you remember the late and early part of the 2010s were very wet years. Recently, it's got drier. And as the dryness has proceeded, it looks like the wild dog numbers are going up. So what are our conclusions from the study? Firstly, we have shown that wild dogs tend to avoid areas frequented by lions, and lion predation is an important cause of wild dog mortality. I'm speaking specifically to Kruger, but obviously to other areas as well. Wild dogs are selective hunters, tending to catch old prey in poor condition. They are certainly not the incredibly efficient and ruthless hunters that they are often still today believed to be. And wild dogs have inordinately high rates of energy expenditure. So perhaps the most important take-home messages from our study has been the wild dog population in Kruger is volatile, giving to wide fluctuation, but it is viable, and that's very important. And rainfall appears to be the most important driver in wild dog population dynamics because of its effect on prey condition and vulnerability and hunting conditions. During drought, prey are simply in much poorer condition and easy prey for the dogs. During the wet years, the wild dogs, in order to balance their own high energy demands simply are not able to catch enough prey to feed pups. So I think in conclusion, I'd like to say that I've been a little bit worried in recent years. I think the Kruger Park population is a viable population. It's a naturally functioning and regulating population. And there has been some tinkering with the wild dog population. There have been some efforts to reintroduce some dogs. There have been fairly extensive vaccination programs. And although these activities may be attractive to sponsors and donors, I don't believe that they are in the interests of certainly of functional biodiversity conservation. And I believe that the wild dog population in Kruger should be left alone and let nature run it. Thank you.